Throughout the course of time, there have been great debates that have simply not been resolved. Was the 1985 Chicago Bears defense better than the 1976 Pittsburgh Steelers defense? Take one from Pittsburgh, take one from Chicago, and you have disagreement. Was Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen and the Chicago Bulls greater than Steph Curry and what's his name? Clay something or another. Yes. You know, when you talk about those sorts of things, you could even get into more, I don't know, mundane things like who was the greatest president or who was the greatest, prime minister of England or orator, those sorts of things. Most people have an opinion, and most people will share that opinion with you. And if they're really committed, they can really get into the conversation, because we all want to be part of a winning team. And so whichever side we've picked, we want them to come out on top. And so we'll make that argument. It's interesting to me because a lot of times it's about stuff that we've not been directly connected to. Now, don't get me wrong. I love the 85 Chicago Bears, but I had nothing to do with the 45 defense. It was phenomenal, but I merely watched it, But I can argue all day long about why it was so much better than the Steel Curtain, But can you imagine if you took that kind of willingness to disagree and that kind of willingness to argue over stuff that's really not connected to us, and you move it ahead some, you move it to a little deeper place, to something that maybe has some direct impact, something that requires even more personal devotion, has had more inspiration or influence on our lives, like maybe people that we've lived with, people who we have followed, people who we have interacted with, and they've really shaped who we are. I mean, you could imagine how that kind of disagreement could go for quite a ways. And I'm not talking about, was Socrates better than Aristotle or something like that. In fact, you see it, believe it or not, you see it more than a few times in the New Testament, in the Greek Bible. You'll see where there's arguments about which teacher is the best. Well, I'm for Cephas. Peter was the one who really impacted me. Well, I'm for Paul, I'm for Apollos, and others who want to take the high ground and say, I'm for Jesus. Now, the reason I point that out to you, and the reason I think that's important, is because that is kind of part of what the author of John is dealing with in this third chapter of John. He's actually dealing with a significant conflict that has arisen. It's arisen between those followers of John who chose not to follow Jesus and those followers of Jesus who can't understand why John's disciples didn't just switch horses. And so, when this is written in about 72, 75 AD, that conflict has been rumbling for a little while. And one of the ways that conflicts like that happen is that the people who follow the people, they make it seem like there was conflict between the two people. So in other words, John's camp after John is dead and Jesus' camp after Jesus is risen, they can kind of, part of how they show that theirs is better than the other is to point out that there was conflict between them. And so what John does is he just wants to put this nonsense to rest. And so the way he does it is to just establish for us that John the Baptist and Jesus were tight. He does it from the very beginning. And he comes back to it here in John chapter 3. And it's so important for us that I'm going to back up to a couple of verses I read last week. And I'd like to read it to you from John chapter 3, starting with verse 27. And this John is John the Baptist we're talking about here in verse 27. John replied, "No one can receive anything unless God gives it from heaven. You yourselves know how plainly I told you, I am not the Messiah. I am only here to prepare the way for him. It's the bridegroom who marries the bride, and the bridegroom's friend is simply glad to stand with him and hear his vows. Therefore I am filled with joy at his success. He must become greater and greater, and I must become less and less." And then verse 31. He's come from above and is greater than anyone else. We are of earth and we speak of earthly things, but he's come from heaven and is greater than anyone else. He testifies about what he's seen and heard, but how few believe what he tells them. Anyone who accepts his testimony can affirm that God is true, for he is sent by God. He speaks God's words, for God gives him the Spirit without limit. The Father loves his Son and has put everything into his hands, and anyone who believes in God's Son has eternal life. Anyone who doesn't obey the Son will never experience eternal life, but remains under God's angry judgment. I wanted to read the whole passage to you because it's such a beautiful passage. You could literally take this one passage that I just read to you, and you could study it every day for this next year, and you wouldn't get it all. It's just that deep. It is that thick. It is just phenomenal. It is chock full of what we would call Christology, or what we would even a wider terminology is to say theology. Now, theology just means how we think and talk about God, right? But it's just that full. And so obviously I'm not going to do justice to this passage in just 15 or 20 minutes. So allow me, if you don't mind, I'd like to read to you Eugene Peterson's rendering of the same passage, because it's beautiful, and I think it gives some light and some insight to why I say this is such a masterful piece of writing that the author does here. Starting again with verse 27 in the Message, John answered, "It's not possible for a person to succeed. I'm talking about eternal success without heaven's help. You yourselves were there when I made it public that I was not the Messiah, but simply the one sent ahead of him to get things ready. The one who gets the bride is by definition the bridegroom, and the bridegroom's friend, his best man, that's me, in place at his side where he can hear every word, is genuinely happy. How could he be jealous when he knows that the wedding is finished and the marriage is off to a good start? That's why my cup is running over. This is the assigned moment for him to move into the center while I slip off to the sidelines. The one who comes from above is head and shoulders over the other messengers from God. The earthborn that is earthbound and speaks earth language. The heavenborn is in a league of his own. He sets out the evidence of what he saw and heard in heaven. No one wants to deal with these facts. But anyone who examines this evidence will come to stake his life on this, that God himself is the truth. The one that God sent speaks God's words, and don't think he rations out the Spirit in bits and pieces. The Father loves the Son extravagantly. He turned everything over to him so he could give it away. A lavish distribution of gifts. That is why whoever accepts and entrusts the Son gets in on everything. Life complete and forever. And that's also why the person who avoids and distrusts the Son is in the dark and doesn't see life. All he experiences of God is darkness, and an angry darkness at that. I made the observation last week that John was impressive because John the Baptist did 3 things, in my opinion, and he does them very well. We talked last week and I said, well, first of all, he clears the way for the Lord. And then secondly, he prepares the way for the Lord. And then thirdly, he gets out of the way for the Lord. He doesn't try to stay up on the stage. He just steps back, And so now we pick up in verse 31. And like I said, these verses are so full of meaning and significance that the best I can do is offer you a little bit of color commentary and observation or two as we go. Verse 31 again, listen to it. It says, he has come from above and is greater than anyone else. We are of the earth and we speak of earthly things, but he has come from heaven and is greater than anyone else. Now, the first thing we need to do is we need to deal with the little nomenclature. And for those of you who are not familiar with that $5 word, as we say back home, we need to deal with the little lingo. We got to get a handle on a couple of words. And one of the first words you got to get a handle on, in my opinion, to be able to even start to understand this, is the word heaven. You see, this was written about 72, 75 AD. Yeah? And so that means that when the people in that day heard it or had it read to them and they heard the word heaven, they didn't think of streets of gold and pearly gates. That doesn't come to the back of the book. That doesn't come to Revelation. Same author, I think, who writes it. It's about 20 years later that he writes it, okay? So they don't have this image of new heaven and new earth. So what you got to understand is the word heaven, it's got about 4 different usage in the New Testament. So one of them is, gates made out of huge pearls. I mean, you can imagine how big a pearl must be if it's a gate. It's hollowed out and you can walk right through it like a redwood or something, except it's a pearl. Imagine that oyster. Anyway, I digress, okay? So there's that heaven, right? And then there's the obvious heavens, right? The first heaven, as the Apostle Paul talks about, because he talks about 3 heavens, right? There's the first heaven, and that's the sky. We just look up and we see the sky, we see the clouds, that's the first heaven. The second heaven, a little further up. That's the moon and the stars and what we would call outer space, right? That's the second heaven. And then the third heaven is where God lives. Now, what many of us struggle to understand is that third heaven. We pretty much got a handle on number 1 and number 2 and number 4. But number 3 is a little tricky. There's this really smart follower of Jesus by the name of Justo Gonzalez, Dr. Justo Gonzalez. And he has written, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful books on the Lord's Prayer. It's a simple little book. He writes in such a way, it's so simple and profound and just blows your mind, Anytime I even toy with the idea of writing a book, I read Justo Gonzalez and I say, never mind. He's just phenomenal, right? And so Dr. Gonzalez in this book, Teach Us to Pray, he teaches us that in the opening of the Lord's Prayer, where Jesus says, Our Father who art in heaven, that Jesus isn't referring to a place up in the sky or outer space or even the place where the pearly gates are. He's talking about that third heaven. He's saying that heaven is actually an acknowledgement for mystery. It's the fact that God is so far beyond us, that God is so far beyond our understanding and our comprehension, that He exists in a way that we can't possibly understand, and you got to give it a word, so give it the word heaven. So when we talk about the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God, Dr. Gonzalez would tell us the best thing you could think is the kingdom of mystery, because it's just going to be beyond you. No, it doesn't mean that there won't be parts of it you can understand and parts of it you can engage with. It's just that, just like God, it will be beyond you. You're finite, He's infinite. Just accept that and you'll be good, right? And so, check this out. I mean, just kind of as a better explanation, let me just read you what Dr. Gonzalez says. He says, the heavens are all that we cannot know. We cannot know. Not simply in the sense that we don't understand it yet, as in the case, for instance, with the law of physics, but rather because the very nature of heaven is a mystery beyond our capabilities. He's a contrast to earth, which is the sum of all that we can understand and explore, be it on the planet where we live or in the most distant space. Heaven is mystery beyond our understanding, beyond our expressions, and even beyond our imagination. So when John says that Jesus comes from above or comes from heaven, he's saying that Jesus is so far beyond us that we can't even begin to understand from whence He's come. Now that's why the author says in this one verse 2 times, he says He comes from above, He comes from heaven. He's saying the same thing. He's repeating it to emphasize it, right? And it's no coincidence that it sounds a little bit like what Minister Emily read earlier from Isaiah 55 verse 9, which reads, "For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." See, the mystery of God is infinite, and the best word we can use to wrap our heads around where God resides is the word heaven. I don't know if you guys have realized this or not. I happen to pay attention to words, and I pay attention to metaphors, and I pay attention to kind of what happens with language because I'm just that geeky. But the word supreme has taken a bit of a battering lately. I don't know if you've thought about that or not. I mean, there's a lot of words that seem awesome. Awesome has taken a battering in such. Literal has taken a battering. There's several words that I just struggle with because they're just not used correctly. And no one's even embarrassed anymore about it. Now, most of the time you can't blame folks. There's no one to point to. But when it comes to the word supreme, there are 2 organizations I blame. Taco Bell and Pizza Hut. Absolutely. You think about this, all right? Just think about this. There was the burrito, and then there was a burrito supreme. And what is the difference between the burrito and the burrito supreme? Diced tomatoes and a little bit of sour cream. Listen, it's so little, such a small amount of sour cream that if you are lactose intolerant, you won't even get a rumble from it. I'm telling you. And they call that supreme. And everyone goes around saying, I'll have a burrito supreme. We talk about that being supreme. It's 2 ingredients. How could that possibly be supreme? And then Pizza Hut comes along, and Pizza Hut has the supreme pizza, which I have to tell you is pretty good. It's not bad. But then what do? They come up with the super supreme. How can you have a super supreme? That means that the supreme wasn't supreme at all. Because if you come up with something that surpasses supreme, that's supreme. Do you see what I mean? And so I hesitate to say this because I'm afraid that you will think wrongly when I use the word supreme. But basically, what John the Baptist is saying and what the author John is writing down for us is to say that Jesus is supreme. Verse 31, he says it twice. Not only does he say it twice in one sentence, but he says that Jesus is infinitely mysterious, that he is above everything. He is above all. He says, look, we're on the earth and he is in heaven. And to show you how messed up here on the earth, we think a burrito supreme is supreme. That's earthly talk. That just doesn't work. We're talking about him in heaven, in the mysteries beyond us, infinite. And that's where he came from. And he came here, and verse 31 says, he is above all. He is above all. That's what he says. He is above all. Or as the New Living Translation puts it, he is greater than anyone else ever. That's supreme, right? And so when you think about that statement for a minute, that Jesus is greater than anyone else, there is no one who has ever been or ever will or ever be greater than Jesus. Jesus is the greatest of all time. That is being made so clear to us, and it's being made by John the Baptist, who is his cousin, his friend, and the person who prepared the way for him. He can never be confused with his competitor, right? But most of us, we don't think of John the Baptist as a competitor, right? And so you got to ask yourself, all right, other than it's cool to know that we follow Jesus and Jesus is supreme, how does that help us? Right? How does that help us? There's this beautiful book that Scott had recommended to me that I'd meant to read, and I finally started on it this week, and I read it in 2 days, and it was a very busy week. Yes, that's why I have bags under my eyes. But the book is by a beautiful, amazing, brilliant psychologist by the name of Angela Duckworth. And the book is called Grit. And part of the reason I loved the book was because she explained so much about myself. I mean, just fascinating to read and to understand. She uses this quote. She talks about this Japanese parable. She's Chinese American. Her parents migrated when she was... No, her parents migrated and then she was born here, I think. I don't remember exactly, but she's first generation American. And she quotes this Japanese parable, which simply says, to fall 7 times is to rise 8. And I'd heard that as a little kid. I was like in the third, that sounds crazy. I was like, Preston, what grade are you in? 7. I was like in 3rd or 4th grade. And I heard that and it just sunk into my heart. To fail 7 is to rise 8. That the whole point was you just got to keep getting back up, right? No matter how many times you fall down, you just got to get back up some way, somehow, right? And so then she says these two things. The one thing is she makes these 2 statements because she's made a whole life study of, accomplishment and how people accomplish things and how they endure things and what's the difference between talented people who don't endure and people who aren't as talented who accomplish much. And she comes up with these 2 statements. Her 2 theories are this: talent plus effort equals skill. That's her first statement, right? And then her next statement is skill plus effort equals accomplishment. So it's not enough to be gifted and it's not enough to try. You got to be gifted and you got to try until that becomes a skill. And then you got to take that skill and invest the effort, and that's how it becomes an accomplishment. And she uses example after example after example. And so, I mean, she sold me. I was actually convinced before I even read the book. I just didn't realize it. And I thought about this fact that Jesus is supreme. And I thought, well, how does that, I mean, don't get me wrong, we're engaged with the supreme being of the universe. We're engaged with the most amazing person who's ever lived. But how does that help me do this life of faith? And I thought about that truth. And I thought about what Dr. Duckworth said. And so this is just a theory. I don't even know this is fully thought out yet. Well, it can't be fully thought out. I've only been working on it for a week. But here's what I got for you. You take a truth like Jesus is supreme, and you put effort to it. Like you wrestle with it and you think about it and you take it apart and you think about all the different ways it applies. And if you take that truth and you put effort to it, it will become a belief. If you then take that belief and put effort to that, how does that impact me? How does that influence me? How does that affect what I do? How does that affect how I talk to God? All of those sorts of things. And you put effort into it, it becomes life change. Now you can call that life change obedience, you can call it transformation, you can call it godliness, but it becomes life change. And the thing that helps us with the effort, the thing that helps give us the grit to keep trying when we fail to make the truth the belief or the belief the life change, the thing that helps us keep trying beyond the power of the Holy Spirit in us is this. Are you ready? There's 3 brick masons, right? These 3 brick masons, they're working at the same construction site, right? And you walk up to one of them and you say, "What are you doing?" And they say, "I'm laying bricks. That's what I do. I lay bricks." And you go up to the next one and you say, "What are you doing?" He says, "We're building a cathedral. I'm building a cathedral." And then you go up to the third and you say, "What are you doing?" "I'm building the house of God." One is work, the other is a career, but the third is a calling. So when you take this truth that the one you and I serve, Jesus, is supreme over all, and he condescends to be friends and be in relationship with us, then anytime I fall down, I just remember he's the one I'm in relationship with. And it helps me to have the unction and the umption to get back up and try again. And that is what I call holy grit. And I think that maybe we would do well if we had some. And I hope you think about that, okay?